A man dismissed a client not because of the project, but because of the color of his skin. What he didn't know was that justice was already waiting at the door. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its rhythm blending with the faint hum of traffic outside. Mid-afternoon sunlight streamed through the dusty blinds of Harris & Co. Contractors. Slanting across the room in golden stripes, the office smelled faintly of sawdust and old coffee, a scent that clung stubbornly to the walls, as though it had seeped into the paint years ago. Behind the cluttered desk sat Mr. Harris, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with thinning hair slicked back and a shirt that strained against his stomach. Papers were piled high beside him, contracts half-freed and invoices waiting to be signed. But his eyes weren't on them. They stared blankly at the door, waiting for the next client or perhaps dreading it. The bell above the door jingled lightly, cutting through the thick stillness. Harris looked up, squinting into the sudden flood of light as the door creaked open. Standing there, framed in the doorway, was Marcus. He couldn't have been older than 30, his posture straight yet cautious. The kind of stance that belonged to someone taught to be respectful in spaces that weren't always welcoming. His skin glowed bronze under the sunlight, and in his hands he clutched a set of blueprints, the edges slightly worn from being handled again and again. His knuckles were pale where his grip tightened, betraying the nervous energy pulsing inside him. "Good afternoon," Marcus said softly, his voice polite, carrying both respect and restraint. He stepped forward, careful not to scuff the polished linoleum floor with his shoes. Each step seemed rehearsed, as though he had practiced this moment in his mind countless times before deciding to walk through that door. He reached the desk, setting the blueprints down gently, almost reverently. They represented more than lines. On paper they held years of saving, sleepless nights filled with sketches, and the quiet dream of building something his family could finally call their own. "I was hoping to talk about a renovation project," Marcus continued, offering a tentative smile. There was hope in his expression, but also a flicker of nerves in his eyes, the kind of nervousness that came from knowing dreams could be crushed with a single careless word. Harris leaned back in his chair, his lips twitching into something that resembled a smile, but never reached his eyes. He scanned Marcus quickly, not lingering long enough on the blueprints, but rather on the man who carried them. The blinds rattled softly as a breeze pushed through the cracked window, stirring the dust motes that danced lazily in the sunlight. The room seemed to pause with Marcus's words, waiting for the response. Marcus cleared his throat gently, his voice steady but softer this time. "I've been working on this for quite some time. It's important to me. I thought your company might be a good fit." He gestured toward the papers, unrolling them carefully across the desk. Lines and measurements spread across the page, clean, precise, evidence of careful planning. His finger traced the outline of a porch, then the flow of the kitchen space. His gestures filled with quiet pride. As he spoke, his words carried more warmth. "It's for my family, a home where my younger sister can finally have her own room, and where my mother can cook without worrying about broken cabinets and creaking floors. I want it to be, not perfect, but ours." He looked up then, his eyes meeting Harris's directly for the first time. There was no arrogance in that gaze, only sincerity and a hope that had survived too many dismissals in too many offices. Just like this one, the silence that followed was heavy. The tick of the clock grew louder, each second stretching painfully long. Harris tapped a pen against his desk, his face unreadable, the faintest trace of disinterest in the way his eyes slid away from Marcus to the window. Marcus straightened his shoulders slightly, fighting the urge to shrink under the weight of the quiet. His heartbeat thrummed against his ribs, yet he stood tall, reminding himself why he had come. The project wasn't just about walls and beams, it was about dignity, about claiming space in a world that too often tried to deny it. The golden light shifted as a cloud passed outside, casting part of the office into shadow. Marcus's reflection shimmered faintly against the glass of a framed certificate on the wall, an unspoken reminder that he was in someone else's territory, playing by someone else's rules. But still, he waited for acknowledgement, waited for fairness, waited for a chance to prove that his dream was worth building. And though the nervousness coiled tight in his stomach, there was also a flame inside him, quiet but unwavering. Marcus had not come this far to walk away easily. Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning beneath his weight. His eyes swept over Marcus with a slow, deliberate scrutiny, not the kind that assessed a potential client, but the kind that measured a person and found them wanting. His lips curled, almost imperceptibly, in a way that made his disdain feel heavier than any words. The blueprints lay open on the desk, bright lines of possibility stretching across the paper. Yet Harris's gaze barely lingered on them. He drummed his thick fingers against the armrest, his expression carved in stone, as though the decision had already been made before Marcus had stepped through the door. Finally, with a dismissive flick of his hand, Harris spoke. His voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a dull blade. "Sorry," he said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "I don't think this is the kind of job we take on." The words landed with the weight of a door slamming shut. For a moment, Marcus stood perfectly still, as if his body had frozen to protect him from the sting. The golden straps of sunlight across his face revealed the smallest tremor in his jaw. Inside, a quiet storm brewed. He knew those words had little to do with the scope of his project and everything to do with him, his skin, his presence, the unspoken assumptions hanging in the stale office air. Marcus's hands tightened around the edge of the blueprints. The crisp paper crinkled beneath his grip, a soft protest that echoed his own restraint. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. Years of practice had taught him how to remain composed when dignity was threatened. This wasn't the first time, but every time, it cut in new places. "I see," Marcus said, his voice calm, though quieter now. He tried to keep his words steady, anchoring himself in the dignity that Harris's rejection sought to strip away. "I thought the plans were clear enough. It's a straightforward renovation. Structural integrity is good. It just needs vision. I've done most of the groundwork myself." He spoke not to plead, but to assert, to remind the man across from him that his dream was valid, worthy of attention. But Harris barely shifted, his face hardening. "Doesn't matter," he muttered, waving a hand as though brushing away dust. "We're selective about our clients. You understand." Marcus felt a chill creep into his chest, colder than the stale air around him. Selective. The word echoed, sharp and deliberate, a code word, a gate slammed shut, wrapped neatly in politeness, but with barbs sharp enough to wound. He forced himself not to flinch. Instead, he let his eyes linger on Harris, studying the man's expression. There was hidden, but not well enough, that glint of superiority, the belief that his decision needed no justification. Harris's gaze had never really touched the blueprints. The silence stretched long, broken only by the ticking clock on the wall. Marcus's mind replayed the moment he had walked in the cautious hope, the careful tone, the rehearsed steps of respect. He had done everything right, and still, it hadn't mattered. Inside, his anger swelled, pressing against the walls he had built inside himself to contain it. He could almost feel it rising like water, threatening to spill over, but he held fast. He would not give Harris the satisfaction of seeing him lose composure. Instead, Marcus straightened his shoulders. His fingers loosened slightly on the blueprints, though the paper still bore the imprint of his grip. He spoke slowly, his voice even, though there was steel beneath the calm. "Selective," he repeated, his eyes steady on Harris. "That's one way to put it." Harris shifted uncomfortably, but the mask of authority on his face didn't slip. He leaned forward, picking up a pen and twirling it in his fingers, pretending to busy himself. "It's nothing personal, just business." Marcus almost laughed. Nothing personal. Yet it was always personal. The world had 1,000 ways of saying, "You don't belong here." And Harris had just chosen one of the cleaner ones. The office seemed to close in around him. The blinds rattled again with a faint breeze, though the air felt heavier now, thicker. Marcus's heart beat steadily, a drum of restraint. His mind whispered for him to walk away, but another voice, quieter, stronger, reminded him of why he was here. This was about more than one contractor's prejudice. It was about proving, if not to Harris, then to himself, that he could stand firm without folding. So he didn't argue. He didn't beg. Instead, he rolled up the blueprints slowly, carefully, the paper crackling in the silence. Each movement was deliberate, measured, like armor being fastened into place. When he finally looked back at Harris, his expression was calm again. But there was something else in his eyes now, something unshakable. "I'll keep looking," Marcus said, his tone polite, yet etched with quiet defiance. "There has to be someone out there who's willing to see the project for what it is, not for who's holding it." Harris's eyes flickered, caught for a fraction of a second by the weight of Marcus's words. But then he leaned back once more, hiding behind indifference, pretending not to care. Marcus gathered the blueprints. his hand firm around them this time, not trembling. He turned toward the door, the sunlight spilling through the glass, bathing his figure in a glow that seemed almost deliberate, like the world itself was reminding him. He wasn't small, no matter how small this office tried to make him feel. As he reached for the handle, he paused for just a moment. His chest rose and fell slowly. He wasn't defeated. The rejection stung, but it didn't break him. And though Harris didn't know it yet, this small act of disdain would soon unravel into something far larger than either of them expected. Harris leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning as if it, too, shared in his arrogance. His lips curled into a smug half-smile, the kind reserved for men who believed they had neatly closed a chapter before it even began. He tapped the pen against his desk, sharp, deliberate clicks echoing in the small office like a gavel sealing judgment. Marcus, blueprint tube in hand, stood near the door. The weight of Harris's dismissal still pressed heavy on his chest, but outwardly he remained calm, his shoulders squared with dignity. He had no intention of letting this man see defeat in him. Still, the sting lingered like smoke in his lungs, bitter and suffocating. "Good luck out there," Harris muttered, as though tossing scraps of courtesy across the desk. He didn't even look up this time, pretending to study a stack of papers. He had no intention of reading. The condescension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. The air shifted, almost imperceptibly. In the far corner, behind a desk cluttered with ledgers and a humming computer, sat the secretary. She was a woman in her early 30s, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun, glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. Until now, she had been quiet, diligently typing, a shadow in the room's background. But something in Harris's tone made her pause. Her hands froze above the keyboard. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, her eyes flicking from Harris to Marcus and back again. Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she swallowed hard and forced her attention back to the screen. Only, her fingers didn't move. Marcus noticed. In that stillness, he sensed something, an unease that didn't belong to him, but radiated from her like a whispered warning. He shifted slightly, testing the air of the room. The tension was no longer just between him and Harris. It stretched outward, invisible threads weaving through the office. Something else lingered here, something unsaid. Harris, oblivious or perhaps indifferent, leaned forward and scribbled something half-heartedly on a pad of paper. His movements were exaggerated, dismissive, like a stage actor performing indifference. He clearly believed the encounter was over. In his mind, Marcus would walk out, humiliated, tail between his legs, just like so many others he dismissed before. But the secretary's behavior betrayed that expectation. She shifted again, the legs of her chair scraping faintly against the floor. Her eyes darted once more toward the door, quick and nervous, as if expecting it to swing open at any moment. Her foot tapped lightly against the tile, a rhythm too sharp to be casual. Marcus caught the flicker of apprehension in her expression. It was small, but unmistakable. The kind of look a person wore when they knew something the rest of the room did not. He narrowed his eyes slightly, curiosity sparking beneath his restraint. Whatever she was anticipating, it unsettled her enough to break her professional mask. Harris remained smug, unaware of or willfully blind to the secretary's unease. He reclined farther in his chair, folding his hands across his stomach. Like a man who had already claimed victory, the blinds rattled again with another passing breeze. Sunlight shifting across the room. The air seemed heavier, charged, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Marcus felt it settle in his chest, that inexplicable sensation that something was about to change. The secretary coughed lightly, forcing herself into motion again. But even then, her hands fumbled across the keyboard. She typed nonsense, her eyes still flicking toward the door. It was as if every sound, the ticking clock, the faint traffic outside, even Harris's pen tapping, was waiting for the interruption. She clearly knew was coming. Marcus adjusted his grip on the blueprint tube. His heart rate slowed, curiosity overtaking the sting of rejection. He had lived long enough to recognize when the air in a room shifted toward something larger than himself, and this shift was undeniable. He glanced once more at Harris, who remained blissfully arrogant, and then at the secretary. She finally caught his gaze, just for a second. Her expression spoke louder than words. "Don't leave yet." The look unsettled him, not in fear, but in intrigue. He didn't know why, but he trusted it. Something was building, pressing at the edges of the moment. Begging to break through, the clock ticked louder, each second stretching into silence. Harris's smugness only deepened. Convinced the matter was closed, he muttered under his breath, a self-satisfied sigh that spoke of his certainty in the predictability of people like Marcus. But Marcus stood rooted, not rushing for the door, his eyes sharpening with patience. Then it happened. The secretary straightened suddenly, her posture rigid, her gaze locked on the door before anyone else had noticed a sound. The faint creak of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, slow, deliberate, growing closer. The handle of the office door rattled lightly, and for a fraction of a second, the room seemed to inhale as one. Marcus felt the tension coil in his stomach, his skin prickling with anticipation. Harris, at last, looked up from his papers, his smug composure faltering ever so slightly as the footsteps drew nearer. Something or someone was about to step through that door, and Marcus knew, instinctively, that Harris's certainty was about to be shaken in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The footsteps outside drew closer, steady and unhurried, like the approach of someone who owned every inch of ground they crossed. The faint creak of leather shoes echoed through the hallway, sharper now, until it stopped directly outside the office door. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. The secretary sat frozen, hands suspended over the keyboard. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, his breath caught in his chest. Even Harris, whose smugness had seemed impenetrable, glanced up from his desk, his brow furrowed with faint irritation. Then the door swung open with a decisive click, sunlight spilling into the dim office in a sudden burst of brightness. The air shifted instantly, as though the atmosphere itself recognized authority stepping into the room. A woman entered. She wore a sharp navy suit, crisp lines cutting a silhouette of precision and control. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, not a strand out of place, and her polished shoes clicked against the tile as she stepped inside. There was nothing hurried about her movements. Each gesture was deliberate, assured, radiating a quiet dominance that demanded attention without needing to ask for it. On her hip, the glint of a holstered firearm. In her hand, a slim leather folder, and pinned to her jacket, catching the sunlight with deliberate clarity, a badge. The badge wasn't flashed with arrogance, but it was visible enough to erase any doubt about who she was. Detective Lewis. Her eyes swept across the office in a single practice motion, absorbing details quickly. They lingered on Marcus for the briefest of seconds, a flicker of warmth restrained by professionalism before shifting to Harris. Afternoon, she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried an edge of steel beneath it. It wasn't loud, but it filled the space, slicing through the stagnant air like a blade. The secretary exhaled a quiet breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders visibly loosening. In the presence of the newcomer, Harris, on the other hand, stiffened immediately, his smug mask cracked. His posture changed so suddenly it was almost comical. His chair creaked as he sat upright, tugging at the collar of his shirt as if trying to make himself appear more respectable. The pen in his hand stilled mid-tap. "Detective," he stammered, his voice a shade too eager. "I wasn't expecting you." Detective Lewis tilted her head slightly, the faintest suggestion of a smile tugging at her lips. Not warm, but knowing. She walked deeper into the office, the click of her heels echoing with authority. Every step seemed to shrink the room around Harris, the sunlight following her in. Like a spotlight dot, she set her leather folder on his desk, the thud precise, deliberate. "Routine check," she replied smoothly. "You don't mind if I ask you a few questions, do you?" Her tone suggested it wasn't a request. Harris swallowed hard. His earlier arrogance dissolved into something smaller, tighter. He shifted in his chair again, his fingers twitching near the papers on his desk as though searching for something to anchor him. Marcus stood quietly to the side, his presence almost forgotten in Harris's sudden panic. But Marcus's eyes were sharp, watching every detail. The shift in power was palpable, like a storm cloud that had been hanging overhead, finally cracking open, releasing a bolt of lightning straight into the room. The secretary, emboldened by the detective's presence, finally moved. She stood, gathering a stack of files, her hands steady now. Her earlier unease had been replaced with a subtle relief, as though the arrival of Detective Lewis was something she had been waiting for all along. Harris's voice faltered when he finally spoke. "Of course, Detective, of course. Anything you need." But the confidence was gone. His words were rushed, eager to please, betraying the discomfort coiling beneath his forced smile. Detective Lewis leaned slightly against the edge of his desk, her posture casual yet commanding. Her eyes locked on Harris, unblinking, dissecting him piece by piece without ever raising her voice. She flipped open the folder, revealing documents Marcus couldn't see from where he stood, and began to ask questions about contracts, about recent projects, about clients who had filed complaints. Each question was simple, but weighted each one chipped at the veneer Harris had wrapped himself in. Marcus's pulse slowed as he watched. For the first time since stepping into the office, he felt the balance of the room shift in his favor. Harris was no longer in control. The man who had dismissed him so easily now squirmed under the scrutiny of someone far more powerful. The golden sunlight caught the badge again, making it glint like a warning. Harris dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief, his confidence unraveling. Thread by thread, the desk that had once been his fortress now looked more like a cage, and Marcus, quiet in the corner, realized with a flicker of satisfaction that Harris hadn't just underestimated him. He had underestimated the world outside. His narrow prejudices. Detective Lewis's presence wasn't loud or theatrical. It was steady, precise, and undeniable. The kind of presence that turned smugness into fear. That reminded men like Harris that arrogance had limits, and consequences often came walking through doors you didn't expect. The office, once heavy with disdain, now pulsed with anticipation of what would come next. And Harris, who moments ago had believed he held all the power, sat stiffly in his chair, his smug smile erased, his eyes darting nervously between the badge and the folder. That threatened to unravel everything he thought he controlled. Detective Lewis opened the folder with deliberate calm, her fingers gliding across the crisp pages. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the faint rustle of paper as she skimmed the documents. Her presence was a storm. Contained, in human form measured, quiet, but with the power to destroy the fragile shelter Harris had built around himself. Her eyes flicked up, pinning him with a gaze sharp enough to cut. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice even, almost conversational. "You're aware of the ongoing investigation into local contractors, aren't you? The ones accused of cutting corners, inflating prices, and walking away with work unfinished." The words landed like hammer strikes. Harris's smug composure cracked visibly. He shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, lips parting to answer. But no words came. His hands fidgeted with the pen he'd been tapping earlier, twisting it between his fingers until it nearly snapped. I've heard some things," he muttered finally, forcing a dry chuckle that died in his throat. "Rumors, you know how they spread. Nothing concrete." Detective Lewis didn't blink. She lowered her eyes to the file again, flipping to a page filled with neat paragraphs and highlighted notes. Her voice remained steady, but each word was weighted with precision. "Funny, because your name appears in more than one complaint. Clients who say they were promised quality work, but ended up with unsafe wiring, faulty plumbing." And she paused, tapping the page with her nail. "Ceilings that collapsed within months." The air in the room thickened. Harris's face grew red, then pale, as beads of sweat formed at his temples. He dabbed quickly with his handkerchief, the fabric trembling slightly in his grip. "Now, detective," he said, forcing a strained laugh, "you know how people exaggerate when money's involved. Clients always want more than what they pay for. I can assure you, Harris & Co. runs an honest business." Marcus stood silently by the door, blueprint tube still in hand. He hadn't moved since Detective Lewis entered, his presence quiet but unyielding. His eyes followed Harris, calm yet piercing, as if he had already expected this moment to unfold exactly as it was. The corner of his mouth curved into the faintest smile, not one of mockery, but of understanding. He knew. He had known from the instant the badge caught the sunlight who this woman was, and what her arrival meant. Detective Lewis closed the folder with a decisive snap that made Harris flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her tone softening but never losing its edge. "It's interesting, isn't it? How reputations catch up to us. You can dismiss one complaint, maybe two, but when the stories line up, when the patterns repeat, suddenly it's not just noise, it's evidence." Her words sank into the air, heavy and undeniable. Harris's breathing grew uneven. He glanced at the secretary, who quickly averted her eyes, choosing instead to tap furiously at her keyboard, though the screen in front of her was blank. He turned back to Lewis, his voice cracking under the pressure. "Detective, surely you don't think I'm my company? We've built a name in this town for decades. My father started this business. We've served hundreds of clients. These accusations are baseless. Lewis's gaze didn't waver. Then you won't mind answering a few more questions, under oath, if necessary. Harris froze. The pen in his hand snapped clean in two, ink smudging across his fingers. He dropped it onto the desk with a curse, his hands now trembling openly. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, watching Harris unravel with quiet patience. His calm smile deepened, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't satisfaction at the man's fear, it was something deeper, vindication. For every time he had walked into an office like this one and been dismissed, for every moment of quiet humiliation he had endured, this was proof. Arrogance eventually bent beneath the weight of truth. Detective Lewis straightened, picking up the folder and tucking it neatly under her arm. "You see, Mr. Harris," she continued, her voice firm, "the law has a way of circling back. It may take time, but it always arrives, and it doesn't care how long you've been in business, or what name you hide behind." Her words sliced through the last of Harris's composure. His face glistened with sweat now, his hands fumbling to clean the ink from his palms with a damp handkerchief. The man who, minutes ago, had leaned back in smug authority now looked cornered, shrinking in his own office. And Marcus silent, steady. Marcus stood taller than ever, the sunlight from the still open door framing him like a figure carved in resilience. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone, unshaken and dignified, was enough to remind Harris of his mistake. The silence that followed was deafening. Only the rhythmic tick of the wall clock carried through the room, each beat a reminder that Harris's time, both in this conversation and perhaps in his career, was slipping away. Marcus's eyes met Detective Lewis's for a fleeting second. In that glance lay a history unspoken, a bond stronger than bloodline alone. She gave the slightest nod, acknowledging both his patience and his quiet victory. Harris, catching the exchange, paled further. The realization settled in his gut-like lead. He had dismissed the wrong man. At worst, still the law, embodied in the woman standing before him, wasn't just circling closer. It had already arrived. The silence in the office had grown unbearable. Harris sat rigid in his chair, his once confident smirk shattered into a mask of nervous strain. His shirt clung damply to his back, sweat pooling at the collar as though the room had grown hotter. By the second, his hands, stained with ink from the broken pen, trembled as he wiped them over and over with his handkerchief, leaving smudges he couldn't erase. Detective Lewis stood calmly across from him, folder tucked neatly under her arm, every inch of her posture radiating command. Her gaze had dissected him piece by piece, stripping him of the authority he so carelessly flaunted only minutes before. The room now belonged to her, and Harris knew it, and yet despite her sharp questions and unwavering presence, it was what she did next that truly broke him. With deliberate slowness, Detective Lewis turned her head toward Marcus. Until now, he had been little more than a quiet figure near the door, blueprint tube in hand, his calm silence sharper than any spoken word. Harris had almost forgotten he was still there, though the man's steady eyes had never left him. Detective Lewis's expression softened for the first time since she'd entered the office. She stepped away from Harris's desk, her heels clicking against the tile, and crossed the space to stand beside Marcus. The sunlight pouring through the door haloed them both in a warm glow, as if the universe itself was highlighting the moment. Placing one hand gently on Marcus's shoulder, she gave him a reassuring squeeze. Then, turning back toward Harris, she spoke with words that detonated in the air like a bomb. "I hope he was treating you fairly," she said, her voice calm, but edged with subtle warning. "After all, family deserves the best." Harris froze. The words hit him with the force of a hammer. His eyes darted wildly between Marcus and the detective, searching their faces for any sign of jest. None came. Marcus's faint, knowing smile finally broadened into something undeniable, quiet pride glowing in his expression. Family. The color drained from Harris's face so completely he looked almost ghostly. His jaw slackened, his handkerchief slipping from his fingers to the floor. The truth was simple and devastating. The man he had dismissed with thinly veiled prejudice wasn't just another client he could brush aside. He was the nephew of the very detective whose investigation threatened to topple his business. The power dynamic shifted in an instant. Harris had built his authority on arrogance, on the assumption that no one could touch him. But now the ground beneath him crumbled. His earlier smugness curdled into desperation. I didn't realize," Harris stammered, his voice cracking. He leaned forward, hands pressing against the desk as if trying to steady himself against the crushing weight of his mistake. Detective, I assure you, I meant no disrespect. Of course your nephew, Mr. Marcus, of course his project is important. I would be honored, absolutely honored to take it on. His words spilled out too quickly, tripping over themselves in his rush to repair what had already been shattered. He forced a strained smile, but his eyes betrayed him wild, pleading. Terrified, Marcus didn't move. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his silence more powerful than any outburst could have been. His calm dignity filled the space where Harris's authority had collapsed. For years, men like Harris had tried to shrink him, but now, without raising his voice, Marcus had become larger than the office itself. Detective Lewis's hand lingered on his shoulder, her expression unreadable as she studied Harris with the detachment of a hawk circling prey. Funny, she said slowly, her tone measured, because when I walked in, it didn't look like you were treating him with respect. Quite the opposite. Harris swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. A misunderstanding, he croaked. A terrible misunderstanding. Perhaps I misjudged. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady, clear. The single word cut sharper than any accusation. He stepped forward slightly, the sunlight catching his face, his eyes unwavering. You didn't misjudge the project. You misjudged me. That's the difference. Harris flinched, shame flooding his features. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The man who had once held all the power now sat silenced, stripped bare by the truth of his own prejudice. The secretary, silent witness to it all, finally looked up from her desk. There was no hiding the faint flicker of relief in her eyes, perhaps even satisfaction. For too long, she had watched Harris operate unchecked, his arrogance ruling the office. But here, now, in the golden light of afternoon, his empire of disdain cracked wide open. Marcus turned slightly, addressing Harris with calm finality. Respect isn't something you offer when it's convenient, or when it benefits you. It's something you either live by, or you don't. The words lingered in the air, heavier than stone. Harris slumped back into his chair, defeated. His empire of arrogance had collapsed not with a dramatic fall, but with the quiet dignity of the man he had underestimated and the unexpected presence of family he could never afford to cross. Detective Lewis gave Marcus's shoulder one last squeeze before stepping back. Her eyes swept the office one final time, ensuring Harris felt the full weight of his downfall. Then she nodded toward the door. Come on, Marcus, she said gently. We're done here. As Marcus followed her out, the late afternoon sun bathed him in a golden glow. His blueprint tube clutched firmly in his hand, not as a symbol of rejection anymore, but as proof of a dream still intact. And behind them, Harris sat in the dimming office, pale and trembling, his silence louder than any apology he could muster. For a long moment, Harris just sat in stunned silence, the faint hum of the office clock the only sound breaking through the heavy air. His knuckles pressed white against the edge of the desk, sweat dripping from his temple onto the scattered papers. He looked smaller, now diminished, like a man who had been peeled away of every shield he once believed made him untouchable. Then, in a sudden rush of desperation, he lurched forward. His chair squeaked loudly across the floor as he stammered, Wait, Mr. Marcus. I spoke too hastily earlier. I didn't mean any of it. Truly, I'd love to take on your project." His words tumbled over one another, frantic and hollow. He forced a smile, stretching it to wide, to strained. The desperation in his eyes betrayed the fear gnawing at him, fear of Marcus walking out, fear of Detective Lewis's quiet judgment, fear of what this moment meant for him. But Marcus, still holding the blueprints firmly against his chest, only regarded him with calm composure. He let Harris's frantic appeals echo through the room without rushing to answer. It was as if Marcus understood the power of silence, the way it could stretch, suffocate, and strip false words of their disguise. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice quiet yet steady, carrying more weight than Harris's panicked rambling ever could. "No, thank you," he said evenly. The words were simple, but they landed like stone against glass, sharp, final, shattering the fragile illusion Harris was scrambling to maintain. Marcus took a small step forward, his eyes unwavering, the golden light from the open door casting his face in calm strength. "I'd rather work with someone who respects me from the start. Respect isn't something you patch together after the fact. It's the foundation of any partnership." Harris blinked, his mouth falling open as though he'd been slapped. His lips quivered, searching for another plea, another excuse, but none came, because deep down, he knew Marcus was right. No amount of frantic backpedaling could erase the disdain that had dripped from his voice only. Minutes earlier, no words could undo the look of dismissal he'd given. Detective Lewis, who had been silent through Marcus's measured response, gave the faintest nod of approval. Her eyes softened with quiet pride, her presence like a shield at Marcus's side. She didn't need to say a word. Her agreement was written in every line of her face. "Marcus," she said finally, her voice low but firm, "let's go, together." They turned toward the doorway, the light of late afternoon pouring in like a path carved from gold. The secretary, still seated quietly at her desk, watched them with wide eyes, and though she said nothing, her gaze lingered on Marcus with something unspoken, perhaps admiration, perhaps gratitude that he had walked out not bowed, but taller than when he arrived. Behind them, Harris remained frozen in his chair, his body slack, his palms damp with failure. The office that once felt like his kingdom now seemed a cage, the ticking clock on the wall sounding more like a countdown than a comfort. He had tried to claw back his authority with apologies, but his words had been too late, too empty, and now, as the door creaked shut, he realized the one thing he had lost could not be bought back with promises. Dignity in the eyes of others and in his own. Outside, the air was warm with the fading sun. The street glowed with streaks of amber and gold, and the faint rustle of trees in the breeze carried a sense of renewal. Marcus inhaled deeply, the weight of the office sliding off his shoulders with every breath. He hadn't needed to raise his voice. He hadn't needed to retaliate with anger. His calm refusal had been enough. Detective Lewis walked beside him, silent for a while, letting the moment breathe. Then, with a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips, she spoke. "You handled that perfectly. Some people think power comes from control, from fear. But you showed him something different. That true power is knowing your worth and never letting someone take it away." Marcus's chest swelled, not with pride, but with relief. He gave a quiet nod, his smile small but steady. "I just wanted him to see that I wasn't asking for a favor. I was offering an opportunity." If he couldn't see that, he glanced at the blueprint tube in his hands, holding it a little tighter. Then he was never the right man for the job. The detective's eyes glimmered with warmth as she looked at her nephew. "Exactly, and trust me, there are plenty of people out there who will not only see your vision, but respect you for who you are. Those are the ones worth working with." The golden light deepened as they continued walking, their shadows stretching long behind them. Marcus felt lighter, freer. The dream he carried in those blueprints hadn't dimmed, it burned brighter. Now, because it would never be tainted by the stain of disrespect. Behind the office walls, Harris would stew in his regret, his empire of arrogance cracking at the seams. But outside, Marcus stepped into the future with his head held high, knowing that dignity, once defended, could never be taken from him. And in that simple act of refusing to compromise who he was for the sake of convenience, Marcus had left behind not just a lesson for Harris, but a lesson for anyone who dared to underestimate him. True respect cannot be begged for or bargained into existence. It is earned, it is mutual, and it is the only foundation strong enough to build anything lasting. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Marcus walked forward, his dream intact, his dignity preserved and his spirit unshaken. The world outside the contractor's office felt different, lighter somehow, as if the very air had shifted. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. Marcus and Detective Lewis walked side by side, their footsteps quiet on the pavement, the silence between them carrying more weight than words. For Marcus, each step was a release. He had walked into that office with hope in his heart, only to have it bruised by prejudice. Yet he walked out with something far greater, the affirmation that dignity was not negotiable, that no man's disdain could diminish the worth of his dream. The blueprints pressed against his arm no longer felt like fragile paper. They were a symbol of resilience, of a vision untouched by Harris's scorn. Detective Lewis glanced at her nephew, noting the calm in his expression. There was no bitterness in his eyes, no rage simmering beneath the surface. Instead, there was a steady strength, the quiet kind that could not be shaken. She felt a swell of pride, not just because Marcus had handled himself with composure, but because he had chosen dignity over compromise. Behind them, in that dim office cloaked with the smell of stale coffee and dust, Harris sat alone, the memory of his own words replayed in his mind. each syllable cutting sharper than the last. The arrogance he once wore like armor now felt like shackles, binding him in regret. He had mistaken power for prejudice, respect for fear. But when the light of truth had entered, when Marcus stood unbowed, and Detective Lewis revealed her quiet authority, it became clear how hollow his throne had been. Respect, Harris realized late, cannot be forced by authority or demanded through intimidation. It cannot be stitched together by hasty apologies after cruelty has already been inflicted. True respect must rise from sincerity, from recognizing the dignity of another human being as equal to your own. Without that, every word, every promise, is nothing but air. Marcus, meanwhile, carried the weight of the encounter differently. He did not gloat, nor did he allow the sting of discrimination to root itself in anger. Instead, he carried forward the lesson, one that had always been whispered in the stories of his community, and now confirmed in his own life. Discrimination may give a man like Harris a false sense of superiority, but such illusions never last. Justice, in its quiet, patient way, always circles back. As they reached the corner where the sunlight stretched across the cracked sidewalk, Detective Lewis finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. People like Harris believe fear will give them control. They think their prejudice gives them power. But fear doesn't build respect, it only builds walls. And walls always crumble. Marcus nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He thought of the countless others who had stood in rooms like that, who had been dismissed not for the quality of their dreams, but for the color of their skin. He thought of how many had been silenced by shame or forced to swallow their pride in the hope of a sliver of opportunity. But today, he had chosen differently. Today, he had walked away with both his dream and his dignity intact. Looking up at the sky, Marcus felt a quiet conviction settle over him. Respect cannot be begged for. It cannot be demanded. It must be offered freely, earned by honesty, and shared in truth. The street around them buzzed faintly with life-distant chatter, the whir of passing cars, a dog barking from behind a fence. Ordinary sounds, yet in this moment they carried extraordinary clarity, because life, Marcus realized, was not defined by the moment someone tried to strip you down, but by how you rose in response. For Harris, the day had ended in shadows, his authority crumbling beneath the weight of his own prejudice. But for Marcus, the day closed in light. The sun's golden rays seemed to embrace him as he walked forward, a reminder that dignity preserved is brighter than any insult hurled. And as he moved toward his future, one truth echoed softly but powerfully in the air, like a refrain carried by the wind. True respect cannot be forced by fear or authority. It must come from the heart. Discrimination may grant a false sense of power, but justice has a way of finding its way back, steady and sure, illuminating what is right. In the end, it was not Harris's disdain that defined Marcus's story. It was his refusal to be diminished, his quiet strength, and his unwavering belief in his own worth. That was the legacy he carried, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been told they were less. And so, beneath the fading glow of day, Marcus stepped forward, not just into the continuation of his dream, but into a truth eternal. Respect is not a privilege to be withheld. It is the birthright of every soul.